Similar to that.
Oh, yeah, people. It's not the party that has, it's the people. The
Okay,
people. Oh, 2 minutes late.
We'll get started.
2 minutes late.
I'm Catherine Baum. Welcome to our October 2016 meeting of the Philosophy Club. I have for those of you who, is there anybody here who isn't on my email, our email list, who wants to be on our email list? Okay, so
I'll write it.
just write it somewhere, the email address, and I'll bring it to you, or you come, okay.
You need it too.
Okay,
These are people
so,
that pay dues.
I'm Catherine Baum, president of the Laguna Woods Philosophy Club, and a member of the Orange County Philosophy Meetup Group. This is our third year here in Laguna Woods Village. To the Laguna Woods villagers, as I said, please join our email list to get our monthly flyers. And to all you philosophy meetup people, Andreas, Bridget, Susan, George, John, and Noella, welcome to Laguna Woods Village. So we have, as you know, we have volunteer speakers come to speak once a month on the first Sunday of the month. And we have them scheduled a few months in advance. Our next one will be from Scripps College. Dion Scott Kikuris will speak. He teaches there. From the UCI Sociology Department, David John Frank will speak on November 6th. And from UCI, Jeffrey Heimerk, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Law, co-colloquium coordinator, will speak on December 4th. So I'm going to now welcome our speaker. And I'm going to take a little while, so I'll get up right away. I have a lot to say about it. Okay. Okay. Since getting his PhD from UC Irvine, Dr. Vulich immediately got busy and is now an adjunct lecturer at philosophy at Chapman and Fullerton colleges, universities I should say, and Orange Coast College. His education is interesting. Good, thank you. Because it's noted here how he started, and this is for any of you who decide you want to get a PhD, and there's one way of doing it, and this is Richard's way. He got an AA in English at El Camino Community College in 2002. Then he went to the university, actually UCLA, and got a BA cum laude in philosophy with a minor in English in 2004. Then he went to the University of California at Irvine and got a PhD in philosophy, which was conferred in 2011. So it's taken him some time, but it's gone all the way from an AA in English all the way up to his PhD. So we're happy to have him. Now, he was here a year ago and gave a talk on, let's see if I remember.
Free will.
Yeah, on free will, right. We had a very spirited discussion on free will when he was here a year ago, a little over a year ago. Richard's graduate coursework was in history of philosophy, ethics and value theory, metaphysics and epistemology, logic and mathematics, and yes, epistemic conception of free will was his last speech here. So Richard was a speaker, so today the title of his talk is Moral Blind Spot, so please help me welcome.
If I use the microphone, is that preferable for everybody? Okay, I don't know if
either way.
I'll just go ahead and use it just to be safe, on the safe side. It's organized. Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate your attendance today, and hopefully we can have a little fun and learn something about the concept of ethics and an interesting problem in ethics that I think more people should pay attention to, and that I think is actually becoming more and more of contemporary relevance and interest to the world of philosophers, and moral philosophers in particular, social scientists as well.
German.
So here's the speech. It's called Moral Blind Spots in Western Ethical Theory and Society. This talk that I'm going to give you guys right now is a sort of dry run for the same presentation I'm going to give in 2017 January. This talk has been accepted for the APA conference, which is the American Philosophical Association conference. So they have 3 of these each year: the Eastern, the Central, and the Pacific. The Eastern APA is the most prestigious, and I'm not yet getting my own talk at the East APA, but I have been a commentator and such like at the Pacific APA, which was held last year in Vancouver. So I was up there giving comments on some papers of some of my colleagues. But this time I'm giving this talk, so I'm going to be one of the speakers on a panel at the East APA. So this talk that you're hearing, maybe it'll make some waves, maybe it'll become something that's more well received later. But you're getting the first crack at it, so I'm really happy to be here to share this work with you guys, and maybe you'll at least not dislike it. Okay, so let's just go through it. I've only got my master copy of this, so I'll try to, if necessary, take a couple of bullet points up here on the board so that we can all stay on track with what I'm saying. So at each new stage of the paper, I'm going to put a couple of just basic, essential bullet points so that everyone's tracking what I'm doing. 1 second while I do that, I'm going to set the microphone down. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start off by talking about 3 traditional sources of moral failure as it's been written about in the whole intellectual tradition of the West. So, much has been written in the ethics literature spanning generations, going back all the way to the ancient Greeks up to the current day. And much has been written in this literature about what is called moral motivation. Moral motivation. What is that? Namely, the phenomenon of feeling moved to do what one judges to be right. So, the basic idea is, it is thought when one judges some action A to be morally right, the agent is motivated, all else being equal, to do that thing A. So, the concept of ethics, when a person judges that some action is their moral obligation, morally incumbent upon them, then typically we are just sort of geared, oriented towards wanting to do that action that we think is what our moral obligation is, something good. So moral motivation simply is that sense of having the motive to do the right thing. And if we didn't have the general sense of moral motivation on a wide basis, then of course we can never build societies and live together peacefully. So in general, it is thought that this is a significant feature of our human capacity. Yes?
You're saying it's innate in us.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what I would probably have to assume based on the writings that have been discussed throughout the years. So is it something innate? Perhaps is it something that we've evolved to have, or is it something that is implanted in us by a divine being? There's a lot of disagreement about these details. But what I think most all agree to is that we do have a non-neutral feeling towards doing the right thing. It's not that we think of it as something that we could take or leave, or that we prefer not to do. So, with exceptions, all else being equal, it's generally thought of as a universal human phenomenon. So given this framework of moral motivation, it would seem that moral failure must arise from 3 possible sources: weakness of the will, ignorance, or malice. So we're going to talk about each 3 of those possible sources of moral failure first. One can fail morally by, for example, knowing that some action A is morally right, but having more powerful desires or impulses that override his or her desire to do A and cause him not to do A. And that would be the case of weakness of the will. Greek language originally, this was called akrasia. And so in some contemporary philosophy circles, it's still referred to by its original Greek name, akrasia, or weakness of the will. On the other hand, one can do something A that is not right because of a false belief that A is in fact morally right, thus demonstrating ignorance about what act is right. And so that's the second case, not weakness of the will, and then somehow having the weakness of the moral motivation overwhelmed by other factors, but instead just being ignorant of what it was that morality required you to do. And then finally, one can desire outright to do what one believes to be evil and wrong, and therefore operate out of ill will, and that's malice, which is, of course, a different case. The malicious person isn't somehow ignorantly fumbling through the world and managing to make mistakes morally, or just being really weak-willed in the discharge of their moral obligations. The malicious person, hopefully there's very few of them in general, or that people don't operate in this way very often, but the malicious person wants to do what's wrong for some kind of hateful, spiteful, or other unpleasant motive. So in all three of these cases of moral failure mentioned here, whether it's, again, ignorance, weakness of the will, malice, one notes the presence of the general concept of moral motivation. So how does it implicate in each case? In the case of weakness of the will, one's moral motivation is overwhelmed by other, more powerful motives. With ignorance, one is motivated to do what is right, but has a false belief about what act is right. And with malice, one is perversely motivated to do the opposite of one recognizes to be good. So just to recap that. Well, in this paper, I want to focus on a somewhat overlooked category of moral failures, explain the contemporary relevance of this overlooked category, and to attempt to state how we might improve on our own moral failings in this area by adopting some of the ethical insights and methods of Indian philosophy of all things. This overlooked class of moral failings are moral failures that result from failures of moral perception. I believe that once we consider in detail how we can fail morally due to the presence of blind spots in our moral perception, we will see that this is a substantial source of moral failure in our world. I hope to offer some suggestions, again, from Indian thought that might help one to identify and appropriately respond to their own such inevitable failings. So it's not like I'm trying to single out a special group of people. I think that all of us have a tendency to occasionally fail to respond or be perceptive about the moral issues that do face us. And so this is a quite general criticism of maybe a lot of members of our culture or our civilization, and therefore I'm not trying to identify a specific class of individuals, but you, I think, know cases on your own. So we're now going to start talking about these three cases of moral failure that were traditionally thought to be exclusive and exhaustive. So the first one is a case of moral failure due to ignorance. So I'm just going to put the bullet point up there so you're aware that's where we're at. Okay, so to start then, I would like to say how failures of moral perception differ from the other three categories of moral failure, and the way that the concept of moral motivation and judgment are implicated in each category. So one category of moral failure consists of those due to ignorance. An example of this type of failure is provided by the authors Wisniewski and Jacobi, who talked about moral blindness. In their discussion, they use this example to illustrate ignorance. So they refer to events in the life of the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Freud famously, is one of the innovators of modern psychology and psychoanalysis. Much of what he has said has been discredited in the full span of time. All this stuff about, Electra complex and penis envy and the Oedipus complex, etc., and that we're all latently sexually attracted to the opposite sex parent. Some of that's been disputed and, of course, dismissed and shown to be unscientific. One thing that we do know about Freud, though, is he was a user of cocaine and that he would recommend cocaine to some of his clinical patients. So about that, later on in his life, Freud wrote of the regret that he felt in having recommended cocaine to some of his patients because he learned, as the rest of the community did, over time that it was harmful and it didn't really have any medical value. And now Freud, in his own words, described his guilt about that as coming from a quote-unquote lack of medical conscientiousness. But these two authors discussing the case, Wisniewski and Jacobi, they more precisely classify this failure as a failure due to ignorance. in how to apply the moral principle that the physician should care for their patients. So this is the highlighted example. Why? Because it's not that he's unaware that the principle of take care of your patients applies to these dealings with the patients. It's not that he's unaware of that principle, it's just that in his case, he was ignorant of what action would actually serve to uphold the principle, whether to recommend this drug or not. And so in a case like that, the subject did something wrong, you might say. Why? Out of ignorance. The subject believes that some action A is morally right, and that it's even enjoined by some type of moral principle, and therefore they have the motivation to do the action A, even though in fact, and unbeknownst to the subject, like we see in this example, the action is not right to do. In such cases, moral motivation is present, but the judgment that acts on the motive is in error. So the notion of moral judgment being referred to here, the idea of selecting the right type of action to serve some moral principle that applies, that is an idea that can be traced at least as far back as the works of Immanuel Kant, a famous German philosopher of the 18th century. A commentator of this topic and of Immanuel Kant has commented that Kant, quote unquote, recognized the need for something to bridge rule and particular situation. So in Kant's description, that's moral judgment. And he said, judgment will be the faculty of subsuming under rules. That is, of distinguishing whether something does or does not stand under a given rule. Charles Larimore, another contemporary ethicist, has suggested that this faculty of moral judgment is emphasized even more in the work of Aristotle than in Kant, given Aristotle's virtue-theoretic account of morality and the sensitivity of moral judgment to particular situations that the cultivation of virtue requires. So Aristotle had a different moral system than Kant. Kant said we should always act according to principles that could be made universal for all. And so if you're acting in a way that could not be made universal, then you know it's inconsistent to do that, since you would not want everyone to do it. So that's Kant's system, and he thinks that comes from straight reason, and that every person that has reason can derive the moral law on that basis by thinking about what principles could be made to universal laws. Aristotle, on the other hand, emphasizes that we should try and establish the right type of character traits, as they're sometimes called virtues, things like generosity, honesty, courage, etc. And so because he places more weight on the concept of just building these character traits in general, a lot of people have said that Aristotle is more concerned with the cultivation of virtue through skilled action, which does require you to actually do things in the real world through action, through your own behavior. So it's less principle-driven than it is trial and error through action. And so for some commentators about Aristotle, the concept of moral judgment looms large, because it's supposed to be that kind of faculty that guides you towards the right action in your daily behavior, and therefore helps you to cultivate these virtues, instill them, and then establish them through reinforcement over time. Anyway, whether it's mostly traceable to the ancient Greek Aristotle, or if it's been somehow updated in the works of the more modern Kant, we see clearly a line that you can trace where there's such a thing as moral judgment. And moral judgment is the thing that allows us to use our moral motive to do what is right in the service of actually selecting the correct action. So, with respect to our current example, the moral failure of Freud can be traced to ignorance that is revealed in the actions selected by his moral judgment. He does not know that recommending cocaine will be contrary to the moral principle that does apply here, which is that a doctor should provide best care for their patient. Okay, so that's one category of moral failure and how it's related to this concept of moral motivation. Now we'll swing to the next one, which are moral failures due to weakness of the will. So, another one. Weakness of the will, and in Greek, I'll just write the Greek word since it's sometimes handy, akrasia, which means the same thing in Greek, weakness of the will. Perhaps more of a specialist term. So, now we have a second category of moral failings. So a second category of moral failings are those that are due to weakness of the will, or in Greek again, akrasia. This sort of moral failing is helpfully described by the mentioned authors, Wisniewski and Jacobi, as, quote, one in which my intention to do X is overridden by a desire to do Y, where X and Y are mutually exclusive, they cannot both be done. I give in to my desire despite my rational intention not to give in to this desire. In this respect, akrasia is a kind of irrationality. It is not, however, a failure of knowledge, so it's different, therefore, from ignorance. We see here how this failure essentially differs from ignorance. Here, unlike in the previous case, one is not ignorant about what action is required by the applicable moral principle. Rather, one's intention to act in the way they correctly judge the principle to require is trumped by some other non-moral desire or motivation to act otherwise, or omit, as the case may be. Suppose, so here's an example. Suppose, for example, that a subject knew of a close loved one that had committed an unjust act, like murder, just making it a very clear case of a morally wrong act. So someone has a loved one that did commit murder, and suppose the subject could either do, we will suppose, the right thing, and what? Turn that loved one into the authorities for their crime, so they can pay a penalty to society, or instead, do what his feelings of partiality and attachment would have him do, and knowingly conceal the act by A, not reporting it, and B, forming the disposition to feign ignorance or even lie if ever asked about the loved one's culpability. So imagine such a subject. This subject recognizes that the act, which is correct, is to report the loved one. And to this extent, the subject does have that motive to do the right thing. It's just that he ultimately fails to do the right thing because his will to do what is correct is weaker than his passionate desire to protect and enjoy the continued company of the loved one. So here we see that in this case, one fails morally, not because of bad moral judgment about what act is right. The subject actually knows what act is right and feels the pull of that moral decision on them, but rather because the subject has too weak of a moral motivation, or perhaps more precisely, too weak in this instance, given the power of the contrary non-moral desires that are at play. So that's the second case, the case of moral failure, not due to ignorance, but due to the weakness of the will. And now I'll just give you the bullet for the third one. Tracking where we're at. Moral failures of malice. I save these for last because they're very easy to understand and they're really not too complicated. Okay. So malice is like a classic case of an evil person trying to do bad things on purpose. So moral failures due to malice are easy to understand. They're simply cases where one knows that some action is morally prohibited and is motivated to do it due to a perverse inclination to deliberately do what is morally wrong. The person so inclined opposes what is right to do and is motivated to do what is wrong. As such, the malicious agent is oriented in the opposite way from a normal moral agent. In such cases, the failure is not one of either knowledge or weakness of the will. Rather, as put by Wisniewski and Jacobi, such actions are engaged in partially because they represent affronts to morality. Jeffrey Dahmer, for instance, was found by the state to have been legally sane in the commission of his brutal murders, meaning that he was aware that what he was doing was wrong, which is the legal standard for sanity and sanity. So clearly in this case, the subject was not committing acts mistakenly judged to be right, that would be the case of ignorance, nor is he committing murder as an alternative to some other morally right action that he just has a weaker motive to do, since he doesn't have any motivation to do anything morally good concerning his victims. So that's a different case, and that's the case of malice. So if we're operating within the traditions of Western ethics and theory, then it would have been thought I just described to you the entire class of possibilities of moral failure. You know, did you do something wrong because you just wanted to do the wrong thing, like a malicious person? Did you do something wrong because you recognized that there was something good that you should have done, but you're just overwhelmed by passions to do the wrong thing? Or did you do something wrong because you actually just were ignorant of what the right action is? Well, there's a fourth, I should say, type of moral failure, and now that's the kind of subject of the rest of the paper that I want to focus in on. So I will now contrast the three types of moral failure just discussed with the other often neglected one, which is the subject of this essay, failures of moral perception. So handwriting. Failures of moral perception. So transitioning out of this. Okay, so we'll go straight to an example that's, I think, a great example provided by another author, Lawrence Bloom. And in his discussion of moral blindness, failures of moral perception, he gave this example. So Tim, we imagine the subject Tim. Tim is a white male waiting for a taxi and is waiting near a black woman and her daughter. A cab pulls up in front of Tim moving right past the woman and her daughter, and Tim is just relieved to get in the cab. Now here's Bloom's description. Tim's relief at having gotten the cab might block from his full awareness the cab drivers having passed up the black mother and child in favor of him. What is salient in Tim's perception might simply be the presence of the cab. End of the quote. So now, in this scenario, Tim, the subject, has had a moral failing because he has failed to perceive the situation as having any moral salience at all. In this way, he has had a failure of moral perception. The racism involved in this situation goes unnoticed by Tim. It has just fallen into a moral blind spot of his. This type of moral failure is importantly different from the other three, as we will now discuss. So, what are the differences? A central difference between a failure of moral perception and the other three sorts of moral failing is that with a failure of moral perception, one's judgment is not utilized, and the concept of moral motivation fails to apply to the subject. This is so because moral judgment is involved in the selection of a particular act or omission for the purposes of upholding some applicable moral principle. That's Kant's discussion, right? What is moral judgment? It is useful for the selection of an appropriate act under the auspices of a given moral principle. But moral judgment is not affected if the person does not recognize that there is a moral situation which any principle applies to at all. So, yes, where am I at? Sorry, down here a little bit. Moral judgment is involved in the selection of a particular act or omission for the purposes of upholding some applicable moral principle. In a case like Tim's, the subject never makes use of moral judgment because he has had no prior recognition that the situation is a morally charged one, and thus sees no need for judging what moral response is appropriate to take. As the author Bloom puts it, Tim must recognize that what has transpired is in fact racism before he can get to the point of using his knowledge that racism is a morally significant feature of a situation to help him figure out what to do. And this is a long quote from Bloom, so I'm going to give you a little more of it. It is moral perception which constructs what an agent is faced with as a moral situation in the first place. The idea of moral judgment as bridging some general rule and particular situation depends on a prior individuating of the situation. It is moral perception which does that individuating, thus providing a setting in which moral judgment carries out its task. So now continuing my discussion, Tim fails morally not because he has deliberately done something he thinks is wrong, that would be malice, nor because he has had a conflict between moral motivation and contrary desires, that would be akrasia, nor because he judges wrongly which action is right to take. He fails morally in a way that is prior to these three other possibilities by simply failing to perceive that he is faced with a morally charged situation that calls for moral judgment at all. Barbara Herman, a famous moral philosopher of UCLA, long-standing tenured professor there, has discussed this concept by arguing that prior to moral judgment, one needs to be capable of, quote, picking out the morally significant features of actions, end quote. And that typically we acquire this skill, these what she calls rules of moral salience in our early childhood as part of our early moral education and socialization. Yes?
I think you see that in traffic quite a bit.
Traffic? You mean the way that people act towards each other on the freeways? You mean like inconsiderate people honking for no reason or cutting you off without any concern for your
They
path?
just drive and get home and they don't think.
Yeah, they may be just so focused on getting home in that instance that they're not thinking about, what moral factors are at play or whether they're violating some kind of basic moral precepts in their daily behavior. So I mean, yeah, but it looms much larger than just this, right? I think it's really saturated through a lot of our day-to-day interactions with others.
I actually think the traffic is maybe a better example, because if you've been in New York, getting a cab is sort of a blood sport,
Yeah.
and it might not have made any difference if the other people were black or white.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, like,
Yeah.
in the hypothetical, though, I get to stipulate that that's the factor at play. So you can you can say empirically speaking, you don't know whether being in that situation would elicit that judgment from you. But I'm just sort of stipulating that is so, and it's certainly something that it would be foolish to say that has never happened. That there's never been a racially motivated decision to skip a person of color on your way to picking up a passenger for a normal taxi cab driver that's not a person of color. Yes?
I would agree with the validity if there was racism involved, if there were other examples of the same man taking his right to the taxi or any other decision.
Right, yeah, you can add whatever additional features to the scenario that you would like in your mind. All I'm trying to tell you is, take it as dogma. The case I'm describing is we suppose racism. What does that mean to you? Fill in the blank. I tried to under-describe it a little bit so that I don't place too much weight on one or the other indicator of racism. But is there racism in the world? Yes. Does it benefit people of color? No. So this stands to reason as an example that could be plausible, right? I'm not too interested in debating the idiosyncrasies of the example for the purposes of whether or not it's racism, because it's a hypothetical, so I get to say it's racism. Yes.
Could you tell me why it's important that the woman had her daughter with her?
I don't know, that's his case. I think it's probably to add a little bit more moral sensitivity to the factors at play, because, you know, when the person's with their child, they would probably like to shield the child from the harsh reality of racial profiling or racially motivated taxi cab pickup, etc. So I think that's probably why, but it's just another wrinkle to the case. It's not, I don't think, critical to the
Thank you
understanding
for
of the
that.
case.
And the safety of the taxi driver, if he brings these people to a neighborhood where he's threatened, is not
Yeah.
considered?
Well, I mean, to assume that people of color are always going to live in those neighborhoods is a prejudicial assumption. I don't think that the taxi cab, because of their job and position, is at liberty to make those judgments about people. It's their job to give to the public taxi cab rides.
I
So a
disagree,
member of the
but I
public,
understand.
you need to be colorblind if you're going to be a fair taxi cab driver. If you're a racist taxi cab driver, then sure, you would just pick up people that you think are going to be from affluent neighborhoods to keep yourself out of harm's way.
Uh-huh.
But then you're doing so on a racial basis, aren't you? And that's not really nice, because what can you get from a taxi cab is the color of the person's skin, and that's it. So it's not nice.
Well, it's
Yes.
obvious that the tip enters into it too.
Well, maybe,
Yeah.
but again, you have to make uncharitable assumptions about the capacity of people of color to tip, to make that comment.
But he has the history of this.
I hadn't said anything about a person's history.
Oh,
I give
okay.
you a case where I stipulate that someone, in a racist way, skips past the white patron, or sorry, the black patron to the white patron.
This is
I
all-
hope that's understood.
This is
But
all
he-
probably really good for you to hear, though.
Oh, no, it is, yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm
Well,
gonna defend my
But
argument.
he
yeah.
would pick up the,
Okay.
probably the male businessman in a suit before he'd pick up
Yeah.
a guy in coveralls. So
Yeah,
because-
but,
Yeah,
well, to what point is your comment?
he's gonna get a higher tip.
Not necessarily
Maybe.
He's
racial.
gonna have probably a better location.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe that's true. Not necessarily relevant to me, but yeah.
Let's say a questionable or not so questionable language by bullhorn within the sound range of a funeral gravesite in process.
Or are you making up something?
I'm just putting that out to see if that's, if it's getting,
We didn't hear.
Repeat the
Yeah.
question.
Sorry, well, maybe, would you like
Okay,
care to
okay.
repeat that?
okay.
Yeah, take the microphone.
You want the microphone? Okay. I mean, it's not a cordless mic, right? So I have to.
Yeah.
He's going to. yeah.
Let's say, a questionable
No,
or
sorry,
not,
you need to click the on switch, it's right there with your phone. Yeah.
a questionable or not so questionable bizarre language by bullhorn within the sound range of a funeral site in
Are you
process.
talking about the Westboro Baptist people or something
Yeah.
like that? Well, it's not really my case. These people, I would say, are malicious, or they're just straight ignorant, because they do think that they're doing something that's commanded on them by God. So they think that they're doing the morally correct thing, but they're not engaging in moral blindness, like they're insensitive to the world of morality. So I'm talking more about implicit bias, not explicit bias. Implicit, unconscious, subconscious, not seen easily by the person having it, hence the word moral blind spot. A blind spot's not something that you know that you have. You have to be told by someone else that something's in the blind spot, or you have to reorient yourself so that you can see what is actually there. But no, I'm not talking about out in the open, blatant acts of overt racism, bigotry, et cetera, et cetera. No, that's not the right case.
In law,
Yes.
they call it
Sorry,
mori-
one second.
in law, they call it malice aforethought.
Yeah, but it's not my topic. Yes.
Let me ask you, why would racism not fall under malice?
Well, because a lot of people who engage in casual, implicit acts of racism do not explicitly avow the fact that they're racist. So do you understand my topic is not about that type of person who is a self-identified racist?
No, but I'm
That's
just
malicious,
saying,
yeah.
I'm
If a
just
person-
saying,
okay,
isn't
so if
racism,
a person stands in front of you and says white people are superior to people of color, and I believe that principle, and I act accordingly,
Ah.
that person is not having a moral blind spot issue. That person is just either ignorant or straight up, I would say, malicious.
Well, that's the point I was trying to make,
Yeah.
isn't racism in general just malicious, period?
No, it is not, because many people who engage in racism do so in an implicit way. They support the institutions of institutionalized racism, sexism, bigotry, etc., without knowing that they are doing so. So no, I do not agree with your premise that people who are racist are malicious actors, all of them, because some people are people like you, me, and others who do so without recognizing and realizing it, contributing to the system of racism without being explicitly aware of it. So let's make sure we know about the topic. Yes, back there?
Oh, I just wanted to ask, there was more to your lecture to come, right?
Yeah, oh
So
yeah.
I was
so
just
many
wondering if we
pages
could,
in.
if you would consider to postpone questions till later in the.
Well, it's all right. I don't mind fielding questions live. It's in
Okay.
a way good because then I see what's on your mind as we go through it. That's fine. Yes.
Finally.
Sorry to keep you waiting. I was
That's
just
all right.
trying to hit everyone.
I want to ask you a question because it seems that this gentleman may not have been racial at all.
Well, it's a hypothetical character.
Because people have tended in the last 50 years to get worse and worse and worse and doing what they know is wrong, but it's like for a second their brain just shuts off. It's like, I'm going to get there before you.
Yeah, well, see, that kind of is not really different from what I'm saying, because if the person's unaware of the way that their action or failure to act is implicated in some kind of
But
injustice.
they know that's wrong because there's.
Well, they might know it on
rules in society.
reflection. They might know it on reflection, but they don't know it in the moment, right? Isn't that what
I
you
don't
just
believe
said?
that. I believe they know it's wrong, but when you're in a certain situation, you're in a big city, you're in a lot of traffic, it's like the brain goes nuts. And I actually see people, I mean, they will take the chance of killing themselves to get ahead of somebody else for 2 inches. It's insane.
It's true that there are pressures at work
And
when a
then these
person's
people
running late
go
to a
home,
meeting.
and they're perfectly nice people. But
Yeah.
they're in this situation, and they just act totally immoral, I think.
Yeah.
Because they cut off people, they could kill people, and it's like this thought that I've got to get ahead of you, I've got to get this taxi before you.
Yeah.
You know, it's their rights against someone else's rights.
No matter who it is.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see them in another situation, and they're nice people, you want coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Well, then I think you're
I
sort
don't
of getting
understand.
the sense of what I'm talking about. Because what I'm trying to talk about are moral failures that are not right out there in the open and easily identified as such. They're moral failures that happen because a person did not realize that the action they committed or the interaction in which they were implicated contained a morally salient element.
They do know.
Well, they don't know in the
Should
moment that
have
they're
known.
doing it, I would say. Otherwise, they'd have the motivation to do otherwise.
It is a blind spot,
Not
because
Well,
they
then good,
know
then
it's
I'm right.
wrong,
Then-
and they
but
get
you see,
into this
blind
massive
spot
thing with
versus
everybody.
no, two different words. You prefer to say no, but I'm thinking of the word knowledge as not being the most appropriate term in this case, because it's not knowledge when it's done impulsively, right? It's something that maybe is implicitly known, but it's not something that they actually think about as they're acting.
But it's like a mass mentality.
Maybe that's one of the contributing factors. It's hard to diagnose why it happens, but I'm just trying to tell you what this type of moral failure is, and to isolate it from other cases where, like, a person, let's say, avows the right to get in the cab first. That's a different case, right? That's a person who has false moral beliefs. In this instance, I think that there's a person who has not considered the moral relevance of the situation at all, and so kind of just goes through it unconsciously without much reflection at all.
In sociology class, you learn moral ways and folk ways.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, say more.
It's this degree.
What is your degree?
More ways
What's
and
an
folk
example
ways.
of each one?
What?
What's an example? Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Oh, like infringing on Constitution and not infringing on Constitution.
Well, I'm getting bogged down in the question, so this is why I'm not on the microphone.
Like-
Probably good
Why
though.
don't you just go ahead and not take any more questions, because we'll never get to the point. What is it you want to tell us about these hypotheticals? We'll go along with you.
I think we're not. I think that's the issue. We're not.
Okay, yeah, so I would like to continue if that's okay with you. I'm happy to take questions as people raise their hands, I'm going to take questions. So you can make decisions about how you want to ask the questions. Okay, so back to the paper. I believe that these types of ethical failings are of great contemporary interest, even though they constitute a somewhat overlooked category in the Western ethical tradition. There has been a recent surge in interest in the topic of implicit bias and the failures of self-knowledge that are often implicated in cases of implicit bias. On my analysis, many instances of implicit bias should be thought of as moral failures due to the subject's failure of moral perception. The subject, for example, fails to see that his pattern of hiring men more often than equally qualified women is due to any sexist bias, and thus never even gets to the point of using moral judgment to decide how best to apply the principle to oppose sexism in his own conduct. This topic is therefore of value to those contemporary writers, and there's a whole huge branch of philosophy and ethics that's now developing in this direction, where we're talking about implicit bias, how to identify it, and how to think about it, since it's overlooked in the history of Western philosophy. This topic is therefore of value to those contemporary writers interested in exploring the obligation that we have to avoid not just overt and self-conscious prejudice and bias, but also implicit, often unconscious bias and insensitivity to injustice. The other three types of moral failure mentioned in the beginning involve the failure of a person who is at least aware of themselves utilizing moral judgment. But failures of moral perception by their very nature are failures of a person who is not aware of the necessity for moral judgment. Since moral judgment is related to what action one ought to take, the three forms of moral failure emphasized in the tradition reflect a concern with actions as the principal subject of moral properties. To argue, as I do, that failures of moral perception should be regarded as a co-equal variety of moral failure with these other three is to run counter to the tradition in Western ethical theory that imagines all ethical situations as involving a self-aware moral judge who wants to select the action that best serves some general principle. Equal in importance to these are failures of a subject to perceive that they should be in the role of the moral judge, to appreciate the moral salience of a moral situation. I believe that we can learn some valuable insights into how we might improve our moral perception by turning to some of the philosophical and ethical traditions of Indian thought. The first Indian method of countering failures of moral perception that I will discuss is to practice mindfulness. In our daily lives, we should attempt to use mindfulness to be more in tune with the moral salience of any given situation. Royde and Schweitzer, another pair of contemporary authors writing about the topic of moral perception and mindfulness, have provided an excellent analysis and empirical study of the importance of mindfulness to ethical life. In their paper, they wonder why unethical behavior is so widespread. Examples for a few include academic dishonesty, pirated software, and tax fraud. They cite Rest, who says that awareness, this is another author, Rest. They cite Rest, who says that awareness is the first stage of the ethical decision-making process. And here's a long quote from this author, Rest. Only after decision makers are aware of the presence of an ethical issue can they move on to step two and bring their moral reasoning to bear on the issue. Rudy and Schweitzer, previously mentioned, argue that practicing mindfulness will serve to enhance our awareness of the moral factors that bear on the situations we face. When we are not mindful, we are likelier to operate automatically and thus prone to exhibit self-serving cognition, self-deception, and unconscious bias. So in general, as these two put it, insufficient mindfulness may help to account for the otherwise puzzling ubiquity, that is widespreadness, of unethical behavior. The concept of mindfulness comes to us from Indian thought, particularly Buddhism. It has been described by two other commentators, Brown and Ryan, as, quote, a state of being attentive to and aware of what is taking place in the present. In that context, mindfulness is used to draw our attention to our own thoughts so that we can identify instances where worldly desires are interfering with our progress towards enlightenment. Now that's in the Indian religious context. But for us, as people that may occasionally or even often find ourselves perpetuating, ignoring, or perpetuating by ignoring various injustices through our moral blindness to them, we would do well to counter this by attempting to remain mindful of the moral factors at play in any given situation and our own thoughts in response to them. As these authors, Ryan and Brown, put it, mindfulness encourages the consideration of all relevant information for a given decision. Mindful individuals may feel less compelled to ignore, explain away, or rationalize ideas that might be potentially threatening to the self, such as conflict of interest or a potential bias. Indeed, the authors do provide empirical data to back the claim. So in a laboratory research setting, there were two control groups. one of them being instructed in practices of mindfulness and then asked to engage in a form of behaviors where it would easily have been possible for them to deceive, to get ahead in the evaluation that would then be performed. And it was shown that people who practiced mindfulness were more ethical in the decision-making process given before them by the researcher. So if you ever want, you can look up those tests. Anyway, so continuing. I note also that the concept of moral failure due to ethical blindness is a novel counterexample to the game theoretic analysis of rational agency, which presupposes that a subject always acts rationally to promote expected utility. As put by Palazzo and Hoffridge, these are ethics writers in the business ethics literature, though person-situation models have dropped the assumption that managers deliberate like philosophers, they still conceive of them as rational actors. Often, and now think of some of the questions I've received, often, however, unethical decision-making is less rational and deliberate, but more intuitive and automatic. As a consequence, the ethical dimension of a decision is not necessarily visible to the decision-maker. People may behave unethically without being aware of it. Okay, I only note this interesting feature of the current analysis and must leave more detailed discussion of the implications of it for game theoretic views for another time. Now, I believe that maintaining a stance of mindfulness toward the moral factors at play in the circumstances we face will help to pull us away from the sometimes automatic and unconscious approach that leads to failures of moral perception. A further, and I believe, complementary strategy for improving on our failures of moral perception is to adopt a stance of ethical pluralism in the evaluation of the moral factors that we are made aware of by being mindful. Indian philosophy and religion are once again instructive in learning the concept of ethical